July 7, 1943. The black soil of the Kursk salient, churned by 1,000 tracks, clung to the hot steel of a tiger eye like a second skin. Inside the metallic beast, the air was thick with the smells of diesel, sweat, and cordite. Unteroffizier Klaus Richter, his tunic stained dark under the arms, peered through his Zeiss binoculars, his view a narrow slice of the world framed by the commander's cupola. Infantry advancing, 300 meters, in the sunflower field. His voice was calm, a practiced monotone over the intercom. Below him, the rest of the crew, the gunner, the loader, the driver, were extensions of the machine, their world defined by their roles. The 88mm gun roared, the tank rocking back on its suspension. A T-34 a kilometer away vanished in a fireball of its own ammunition, the sound of the hit reaching them a second later as a dull, satisfying crump. This was the zenith of German armored warfare. The Tiger was a legend in steel, its frontal armor impervious to almost anything the Soviets could throw at it. A sense of invincibility, hard-earned and coldly logical, permeated the crew. They were the apex predators of this vast, burning plain. Then, a new sound cut through the din of artillery and machine gun fire. Not the deep-throated roar of a bomber squadron, nor the high-pitched scream of a Stuka. This was a lower, angrier sound, a guttural, grinding drone that seemed to emanate from the horizon itself. Richter swung his binoculars. Aircraft, low and slow. Shturmoviks. He almost spat the word. A grim smile touched his lips. He'd seen these Betonflugzeug, concrete planes, before. They were clumsy, brutish things, lacking the elegant lethality of a Messerschmitt or the terrifying dive of a Stuka. In the briefing tents, intelligence officers had dismissed them with a chuckle. Flying tanks, they'd said, but with all the speed and grace of a brick. Hans, Richter said to his gunner, keep on the anti-tank guns. Ignore the flies. They'll bounce their pop guns off our roof and go home. The first wave approached, looking less like aircraft and more like heavily laden beasts of burden. Their noses were blunt, their wings thick, and their cockpits were encased in a heavy tub of armor plate that gleamed dully in the hazy sun. They didn't dive. They waded in, descending in a shallow, menacing glide. Richter tracked one through his glasses. It seemed to hang in the air, a sluggish, ugly target. He could almost imagine the Soviet pilot, a faceless man in a leather helmet, straining at the controls. A pair of Bf-109s slashed through the formation, and one of the Ilyushin shuddered, shedding pieces as it corkscrewed into the earth. A cheer crackled over the German radio net. See? Lumbering fools. But then, the ones that survived the fighters kept coming. They didn't break off. They flew through their own losses, a swarm of iron bees intent on their sting. The grinding drone of their engines was now a pervasive thunder, drowning out the battlefield below. The lead Il-2, its dark green camouflage streaked with oil and soot, leveled out barely 50 meters above the ground. It was heading directly for a Panzer IV to their left. Richter watched, a spectator for a moment. He saw the underwing pods flash, and a salvo of rockets streaked away, trailing white smoke. They walked across the Panzer IV, not scoring a direct hit, but chewing up the ground around it. Then, as the aircraft filled his viewfinder, he saw the two long, slender barrels under its wings spit fire. Not the pop guns he'd expected. This was a heavier, more percussive sound. 2 dozen 23mm high-explosive shells ripped into the side of the Panzer IV. The thinner side armor was no match for the aerial cannon. The tank slewed to a halt, smoke pouring from every hatch. The Il-2, seemingly unharmed by the light flak now stitching the air around it, flew on, its mission complete. Richter's smile was gone. The laughter had died in his throat. The death of the Panzer IV was not an isolated event. It was the opening note of a symphony of destruction. The sky, once a vast empty blue, was now thick with the Ilyushins. They came not in neat formations, but in a relentless, buzzing swarm, a dark cloud descending upon the German spearhead. The initial dismissal from the German tank crews curdled into a cold, sharp realization. These were not individual pests to be swatted away. This was a biblical plague of steel. Inside the Tiger, the world dissolved into a cacophony of noise and fear. The gentle ping of rifle fire on their armor was replaced by the violent, terrifying crack, crack, crack of the Il-2's 23mm cannons. It was the sound of a giant's fist hammering on their roof. Richter ducked instinctively as a stream of shells walked across the engine deck, each impact sending a shower of sparks and a vibration through the 57-ton behemoth. The armor held, but the psychological effect was devastating. For the first time, their mobile fortress felt like a trap. "Driver evasive! Zigzag!" Richter barked, his voice losing its practiced calm. The Tiger lurched as Gefreiter Schmidt threw the steering levers, the massive tank weaving awkwardly across the pock-marked earth. Through his periscope, the gunner, Hans, saw a horror unfold. Another Il-2, its wing torn by flak, refused to die. It kept coming, a wounded bull, its pilot seemingly intent on taking one of them with him. He fired his cannons, the shells chewing up the ground in a line that raced towards their flank. Then, at the last possible second, the pilot released his payload. A cluster of dark cylinders tumbled from its wings. "Bombs!" Hans screamed. The world outside erupted. The concussion was not a sound, but a physical force that slammed into the Tiger. The steel box they inhabited rang like a cathedral bell. Richter's head snapped back, cracking against the radio set. Stars exploded in his vision. For a moment he was deaf, the battle outside replaced by a high-pitched whine. Dirt and debris rained down on the cupola, blotting out the sun. When his vision cleared, he saw the Panzer III that had been operating on their right flank. It was gone, replaced by a burning crater and a twisted skeleton of metal. The Il-2, having sacrificed itself, had disappeared into the smoke and fire, but another was already taking its place. This was the true terror of the Shturmovik. They were not just armored, they were numerous, overwhelmingly so. For every one that fell, trailing smoke and fire, two more seemed to emerge from the haze. The Soviet High Command had built them by the tens of thousands, a brutal, simple logic applied to air warfare. Quantity has a quality all its own. Richter watched, helpless, as an Il-2 lined up on a neighboring Tiger. This one employed a different tactic. It flew a steady, level course, right down the line of the tank's long axis. The 23mm shells slammed into the thinner rear deck, seeking the grills that cooled the engine. He saw smoke, then flame, then a secondary explosion as the ammunition cooked off. The Tiger's turret, weighing over 10 tons, was lifted from its race and tossed aside like a toy. The mighty Predator, the terror of the Eastern Front, had been gutted from the sky. A new sound joined the hellish orchestra, the frantic rising whine of their own engine. Schmidt was pushing the Maybach to its limits, trying to find cover, any cover, from this aerial abattoir. The sense of invincibility had not just been shattered, it had been pulverized, replaced by a primal, clawing fear. They were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. The whine of the Maybach engine peaked, a scream of mechanical agony, and then dropped into a choked, sputtering cadence. A wave of acrid black smoke billowed from the exhausts, engulfing the Tiger in its own private shroud. "We're hit. Engine damage," Schmidt yelled, his voice cracking with panic. The massive tank, now a 57-ton anchor, slowed to a halt. They were stranded, a sitting duck in the middle of the burning steppe. The sense of entrapment was absolute. The thick armor that had been their salvation against Soviet guns was now the walls of their iron coffin. Outside, the world was a vision of hell, framed by Richter's cupola. The Shturmoviks owned the sky. He saw one fly so low that the blast from its rockets rocked the stationary Tiger. Another passed overhead, and he could clearly see the welds on its armored belly and the grim, determined face of the rear gunner, sweeping the ground with his machine gun. The air was thick with the smell of burnt fuel, explosives, and something darker, sweet, and metallic. The smell of cooked flesh from the destroyed tanks around them. "Hans! Traverse turret! Use the coaxial! Anything! Try to scare them off!" Richter commanded, knowing it was futile. The 7.1902mm MG-34 was a pea shooter against these flying fortresses. But they had to do something. The electric motor of the turret whirred, a pathetic response to the apocalyptic symphony outside. A shadow fell over them. Another Il-2, this one with distinctive red stars bold on its wings, lined up for its attack run. It was coming directly from the front, a perfect, terrifying profile. Time seemed to slow. Richter could see the details of the aircraft, the patches on its skin, the exhaust stains along the fuselage. He was staring into the face of his own death. "Brace!" he screamed into the intercom. This pilot was a hunter. He didn't waste rockets. He held his fire until the last possible second. The two 23mm cannons and two 7.62mm machine guns in the wings spoke as one, a concentrated blast of fire and steel that walked directly up the Tiger's glacis plate. The sound was deafening, a continuous, shrieking impact of high explosive shells and solid shot. The vision blocks in the driver's compartment shattered. A splinter of optical glass ricocheted inside, drawing a line of blood across Schmidt's cheek. But the frontal armor held. The 100mm of hardened steel did its job. A collective, shuddering breath was drawn inside the smoky confines of the tank. They had survived. The relief was short-lived. The Il-2 roared over them, but as it passed, the rear gunner in his cockpit let loose with his 12.7mm Berezine UBT machine gun. The heavy rounds, designed to shred aircraft, now raked the Tiger's superior deck, the one part of the tank not designed to withstand a direct attack. They punched through the thinner steel like a fist through paper. The interior of the Tiger became a maelstrom of whining, fragmented metal. Richter heard a wet, choked cry from the radio operator's station. A flash of light, then a fire started near the ammunition stowage. The smoke inside turned from oily black to a sickening chemical white. "Aussteigen, everybody out," Richter roared, slamming the hatch open. The once inviolable fortress was bleeding, burning, dying. The laughter was a distant, foolish memory. The flying tank had not bounced off. It had swarmed and pecked and clawed, and finally, it had found a way in. The world outside was a sensory overload of chaos and terror. Richter tumbled out of the commander's cupola, the hot metal searing his palms even through his gloves. He hit the churned black earth with a grunt. The air knocked from his lungs. The sound was unimaginable. The grinding drone of the Il-2s, the scream of dying men, the constant crump of explosions, and the fierce, angry crackle of the fire consuming his Tiger. He scrambled on all fours, putting distance between himself and the brewing inferno. The others followed, Schmidt the driver and the loader, their faces blackened with soot and etched with a blank, primal horror. Hans, the gunner, did not make it out. The memory of that choked cry would haunt Richter forever. He risked a glance back. Flames were licking from every hatch of the Tiger. The ammunition inside was beginning to cook off, a series of muffled thumps that sent shuddering vibrations through the ground. The mighty cat was being eviscerated from within. He saw another Il-2, this one with a gaping hole in its wing, still firing its cannons into a cluster of German half-tracks before cartwheeling into the ground in a final sacrificial fireball. This was not warfare as they understood it. This was annihilation from a direction they had considered safe. The sky, the domain of their elegant Luftwaffe, had been taken over by these brutish, unstoppable insects. They didn't fight with finesse. They fought with mass and armor, and a terrifying, relentless willingness to absorb punishment. Crawling into a nearby crater, Richter pressed himself against the cool earth, his body trembling uncontrollably. He watched the swarms of Shturmoviks continue their work. The initial wave, the one that had targeted the tanks, was now replaced by others. They fell upon the support vehicles, the artillery positions, the infantry desperately trying to dig in. They used everything: cannons, rockets, and the dreaded PTAB hollow charge bomblets, which they scattered from containers like deadly seed, each one capable of burning through the thin top armor of any vehicle below. The German counterattack at Kursk, Operation Citadel, was meant to be the decisive blow, the mighty hammer strike that would break the Soviet back. But looking up at the sky, still dark with the crosses of the Ilyushins, Richter understood a new, grim reality. The hammer had met an anvil, and the anvil was falling from the sky. The Arrogance was gone, burned away in the fuel fire of his tank. The laughter that had echoed in the briefing tents now seemed like the foolish boasts of men who did not understand the nature of this war in the East. They had mocked the Flugzeug for its lack of speed, its crude construction. They had failed to see its purpose: to survive, to get to the target, and to unleash hell. It was not a finesse weapon, it was a sledgehammer. And today, the sledgehammer had swung. As the sun began to set, casting a bloody glow over the smoldering wreckage of an entire armored division, the drone of the engines finally began to recede. The swarm moved on, seeking fresh prey. In the sudden relative quiet, broken only by the crackle of flames and the moans of the wounded, the lesson was complete. The flying tank was no joke. It was the herald of a new kind of war, and its message was written in fire and steel across the fields of Kursk.